In today's episode, we'll be discussing homeostasis. No matter what activity you're participating in, whether it's hiking in freezing cold temperatures or studying in a really hot library, your body is working to maintain its internal temperature near a set point of 37 degrees Celsius. During the activities that you participate in on a daily basis, your body works to maintain your blood glucose level, as well as the pH of your blood close to 7.4. My point is that no matter the external environment that you're in, your body is constantly working to maintain a stable or relatively constant internal environment. So this tendency of our body to want to maintain a relatively constant internal environment is what is known as homeostasis. And it is crucial for survival because those fluctuations that occur in our body, if those weren't regulated, it could potentially be deadly. So homeostasis is maintained through our body systems that use feedback systems. And feedback systems are a cycle of events in which a variable is monitored, assessed, and then adjusted. Regarding a negative feedback system, the body works to reverse a change detected in a variable so that the variable is brought back to within a normal range. What is scientifically occurring here is a sensor is going to detect the change that has disrupted homeostasis, and then it's going to signal a control center, and the control center will then activate an effector which will cause the change to reverse. Did you know that when you sweat, that is actually an instance of a negative feedback system? What is happening here is your body has exceeded its internal temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. Thus, your body temperature needs to decrease to maintain that. So you start sweating, which will cool your body down. A positive feedback system, on the other hand, is actually quite the opposite. It tends to strengthen or increase a change in a variable. An example of a positive feedback system is when contractions are regulated during childbirth. When a woman is giving birth, the uterus contracts, forcing the baby's head into the cervix. When this happens, more oxytocin is produced, which is a hormone that causes the muscles in the wall of the uterus to contract, and that causes labor to continue. So before we dive into the nervous system, let's review some of the components. So the nervous system is made up of two different types of cells. There's neurons, and there's the cells that support those neurons. And neurons are organized into tissues called nerves. Neurons have specialized cell functions that enable them to transmit nerve impulses. Different types of neurons have different shapes and sizes. However, they all have dendrites, a cell body, an axon, and branching ends. Dendrites are short branching terminals that receive nerve impulses from other neurons or sensory receptors, and they relay that impulse to the cell body. So the cell body processes input from the dendrites, and if that input received is large enough, the cell body relays it to the axon where an impulse is initiated. So the axons conduct impulses away from the cell body, and they can range in length from 1 millimeter to 1 whole meter, depending on the neuron's location in the body. So neurons can be classified by structure. However, more importantly, neurons are classified as one of three main types based off of function. Some neurons are used for sensory input. Sensory neurons transmit impulses from sensory receptors in the central nervous system. So the interneurons, or the connector neurons as I say, are found entirely within the central nervous system and act as a link between the sensory and motor neurons. Other neurons are used for motor output. Motor neurons transmit information from the central nervous system to effectors. Effectors include muscles, glands, and other organs that respond to impulses from motor neurons. All these types of neurons work together to allow you to take physical action from something you sense in the external environment. A nerve impulse consists of a series of action potentials. When the potential difference across the neuron membrane increases to negative 50 millivolts from the previous negative 70 millivolts. The axons of some neurons are enclosed in an insulating layer called a myelin sheath. A neuron with myelinated axons can conduct an impulse at a faster rate, since the myelin sheath acts as an insulator that helps to propagate the electrical signal faster. The connection between two neurons or a neuron and an effector is called a synapse. A neuromuscular junction is a synapse between a motor neuron and a muscle cell. Chemical messengers called neurotransmitters carry signals from one neuron to another. However, neurotransmitters can also carry the signal from a neuron to an effector, such as a gland or a fiber muscle. Some examples of neurotransmitters are dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. For instance, dopamine affects the brain synapses in control of body movements, and it is linked to the sensations of pleasure. Now that we have a pretty good understanding of neurons, let's dive into the central nervous system. The central nervous system is the structural and functional center for the entire nervous system, and it is the site of neural integration and processing. The central nervous system essentially receives information from the sensory neurons, and it evaluates this information and initiates the outgoing responses to the body. In addition, the central nervous system is made up of myelinated neurons that form what is known as white matter, as well as unmyelinated neurons that form the gray matter. The spinal cord is the communication link between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. It is made up of a column of nerve tissue that extends out from the skull from the brain and downward through a canal with the backbone. Within the spinal cord, sensory nerves carry information from the body to the brain for interpretation, and motor nerves relay messages from the brain to the effectors. Another main component of the central nervous system is obviously the brain. The brain can be divided into three general sections: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The hindbrain is responsible for coordination and homeostasis. The midbrain is responsible for processing sensory input, and the forebrain is responsible for thought, learning, and emotion. The cerebellum in the hindbrain is part of the brain that is involved in unconscious coordination of posture, reflexes, and body movements, as well as fine motor skills. The pons acts as a relay center between the neurons of the right and left halves of the cerebrum. Moving on from the hindbrain to the midbrain is responsible for processing information from sensory neurons in the eyes, ears, and nose, and it relays visual and auditory information between areas of the hindbrain and the forebrain. The thalamus is responsible for providing connections between the forebrain and the hindbrain and between areas of the sensory system and the cerebellum. The hypothalamus helps to regulate the body's internal environment, as well as certain aspects of behavior. Finally, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and it is divided into the right and left cerebral hemispheres, which contain the centers for intellect, learning, memory, consciousness, and language. It interprets, controls, and responds to sensory information. The right side of the brain, or the right cerebral hemisphere, is associated with holistic and intuitive thinking, creative abilities, and visual skills. The left side of the brain, on the other hand, is responsible for the linguistic and mathematical skills. The cerebral cortex is the thin layer of gray matter that covers the white matter of the cerebrum, and it is responsible for language, memory, personality, vision, conscious thought, and other activities associated with thinking and feeling. Now let's break down the cerebral cortex. In summary, the occipital lobes receive and analyze visual information, and the temporal lobes share the processing of this visual information, although their main function is auditory reception. The parietal lobes receive and process sensory information from the skin, and the frontal lobes are responsible for integrating the information from other parts of the brain and control reasoning, critical thinking, memory, personality, and language use. The frontal lobes are also responsible for precise voluntary motor movement. Now let's move on to the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of the somatic system and the automatic system. The somatic system is largely under voluntary control. Its sensory neurons carry information about the external environment inward from the receptors in the skin, tendons, and muscles. In contrast to the somatic system, the automatic system is under automatic or involuntary control, and it helps regulate the internal reactions to a situation. It essentially maintains homeostasis by adjusting the body to variations in the external and internal environments without conscious thought. The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic system carry information to the effectors and have opposing functions. The sympathetic nervous system involves the body's response to stressful or dangerous situations. It acts as though it needs an extra boost of energy. Therefore, blood pressure increases and the heart beats faster, while digestion would slow down and the bladder constricts. The parasympathetic nervous system is activated when the body is calm and in rest. It acts to restore and conserve energy. In response, the parasympathetic nervous system slows the heart rate, reduces the blood pressure, promotes the digestion of food, and stimulates the reproductive organs. Now that we know all about the nervous system, let's move on to the endocrine system. Both the nervous systems and endocrine systems facilitate cellular communication and control. The endocrine system is made up of endocrine glands that secrete chemical messengers called hormones directly into the bloodstream, and the blood carries the hormones throughout the body. Different hormones are responsible for many functions. Some regulate growth and development, others speed up or slow down the body's metabolism, and others regulate blood pressure or immune response. The glands that make up the endocrine system are the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the thyroid, the parathyroid, and the adrenal gland. A target cell is where the body wants to send a hormone, and those contain receptor proteins. Circulating hormones bind to their specific receptor proteins. Steroid hormones such as testosterone or estrogen are lipid-based, meaning that they're able to diffuse easily through the lipid bilayer. And inside the target cell, steroid hormones bind to the receptor proteins, and this interaction activates specific genes, causing changes in the cell. Water-soluble hormones such as amino acid-based hormones cannot diffuse across the cell membrane. Typically, these water-soluble hormones bind to the receptor protein on a surface of the target cell, and this triggers a series of reactions inside of the target cell. It was always thought that the pituitary gland was the master gland because many of the hormones it secretes stimulate other endocrine glands. However, the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland releases 6 main hormones associated with the body's metabolism, growth, development, reproduction, and other crucial life functions. The posterior pituitary gland is considered part of the nervous system and does not produce any hormones, but it does store them and release them. The anterior pituitary gland is what actually synthesizes the hormones, and it releases 6 major hormones, including thyroid-stimulating hormone as well as human growth hormone. Other than the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland secretes thyroxine, which helps increase the rate at which the body metabolizes fats, proteins, and carbohydrates for energy. When the thyroid is underactive, it is called hypothyroidism, and that means the thyroid isn't producing enough thyroxine to regulate metabolism, and this could result in weight gain, puffy skin, a slow pulse rate, and fatigue. The overproduction of thyroxine is called hyperthyroidism. Since thyroxine stimulates metabolism, this results in weight loss, heat intolerance, irregular heartbeat, anxiety, and insomnia. Now let's move on to the adrenal glands, where the adrenal medulla helps to regulate the short-term stress response, while the adrenal cortex helps to regulate the long-term stress response. The adrenal medulla helps to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which regulate a short-term stress response. In fact, these hormones are closely related to the sympathetic nervous system. This is why the adrenal medulla is considered a neuroendocrine structure. Similarly to the sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine and norepinephrine prepare the body for a fight or flight response. These hormones cause metabolism to be stimulated, and there's an increase in breathing rate, heart rate, blood pressure, blood flow to the muscles, and the conversion of glycogen to glucose in the liver. In order for epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released, however, the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system carry a signal to the hypothalamus directly to the adrenal medulla. These neurons stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete these hormones. The effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine occur very rapidly because they are controlled by the nervous system. However, as they are hormones, they have long-lasting effects. Moving on to the adrenal cortex, which helps regulate the long-term stress response, it releases corticoid hormones. In response, blood sugar is increased as well as blood pressure. Cortisol is the most common glucocorticoid. When the body senses that it's in danger, the hypothalamus is alerted to secrete ACTH, which then in return causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. The main purpose of cortisol is to raise the blood glucose levels. However, long-term stress can impair thinking, damage the heart, cause high blood pressure, and that could even lead to diabetes. Now let's move on to the pancreas, which does not only produce digestive enzymes assisting in digestion, but it also acts as an endocrine gland secreting hormones. The beta cells of the pancreas secrete insulin, which helps to decrease the level of blood glucose. However, glucagon is secreted by alpha cells, which increases the level of blood glucose. Diabetes occurs when the body does not produce enough insulin or it does not respond properly to the insulin production, and this results in high levels of blood glucose. When your blood sugar is high, your body metabolizes protein and fat for energy, and your kidneys are unable to absorb all the excess glucose. So the glucose is secreted in the urine, resulting in people with diabetes having low energy and great thirst. Hyperglycemia occurs when your blood sugar is excessively high and can result in fatigue. Juvenile diabetes, or type 1 diabetes, is when the immune system produces antibodies that essentially attack and destroy the cells of the pancreas that are responsible for producing insulin. While type 2 diabetes is often preventable and is associated with obesity and lack of exercise. It is caused when the insulin receptors on the body's cells stop responding to insulin. It wasn't until 1921 when Frederick Banting came up with the treatment for diabetes by isolating insulin. But many people with diabetes today use insulin pumps, which essentially mimic a healthy pancreas. So moving on from our body's stress responses and hormonal activity, let's go into the reproductive system. The female reproductive system contains the ovaries, which produce the reproductive egg cells, while the male reproductive system contains the testes, which produces the reproductive sperm cells. However, both systems also produce hormones. The interstitial cells of the testes secrete the male hormone testosterone. FSH and LH help to produce sperm and release testosterone, which helps develop sex organs and secondary sexual characteristics. Inhibin is another hormone that helps regulate sperm production by developing a feedback loop with FSH. So, unlike the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system does not mass produce sex cells, which for females, those are the eggs. The ovaries are located in the lower abdomen and regulate the production of ova, which are the eggs. The uterus is also the location of fetal development, and there's many blood vessels within the uterus that provide nutrients for the fetus. The menstrual cycle is made up of two individual cycles, one being the ovarian cycle, which is related to the follicles, which are structures inside the ovary. Once the ovum is released, LH causes the follicle to develop into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone and some estrogen. And later on in the cycle, the corpus luteum degenerates, and that leads to a decrease in the levels of estrogen and progesterone. The uterine cycle, which is the second cycle of the menstrual cycle, is when ovulation takes place about halfway. Menstruation has occurred on the first day of the uterine cycle, and that is when the corpus luteum has degenerated and the blood contains low levels of sex hormones. Menopause occurs at approximately 50, and this is when a woman no longer produces ova, so she is no longer fertile. And now let's move on to the excretory system, which involves the disposing of waste products. The excretory system is responsible for the production of urine, and the kidneys excrete metabolic waste, specifically nitrogenous wastes, such as ammonia, urea, and uric acid. An important function of the kidneys is to help maintain the appropriate balance of water and salt in the blood, as blood volume is closely related to the balance of salt in the body. The kidneys also help to regulate the acid-base balance of the blood, maintaining the blood's pH at approximately 7.4. They also assist in the endocrine system, however, producing two different hormones. The kidneys release the urine to ureters, which are long tubes that carry the urine to the urinary bladder through peristalsis. The urine is released through the bladder when sphincters relax. The sphincters are controlled by the brain, and the urine is released through the urethra that attaches to the bladder. The kidneys contain nephrons that are attached to the renal medullas, and they are responsible for filtering various substances from the blood, transforming it into urine. There's a cap-like structure on the top of each nephron, and it is called the Bowman's capsule. Within each capsule, the renal artery enters and splits into a fine network of capillaries. The walls of the glomerulus act as a filtration device. They are impermeable to proteins, other large molecules, and red blood cells, so these remain within the blood, while water, small molecules, ions, and urea are the main waste products that are released through the walls and proceed further into the nephrons. Other than the filtration system of the nephrons, they are also made up of a tubule that is attached to the Bowman's capsule, and it is responsible for absorbing substances that are useful to the body, such as glucose and a variety of ions, and it works similarly to the small intestine. Finally, the tubule empties into a larger pipe-like channel called a collecting duct. It acts as a water conservation device, reclaiming the water from the filtration system by passing through it so that there is very little water lost from the body. That's all for today's episode on homeostasis. I hope you enjoyed.